1. Take this workshop. 2. Write a list poem. 3. Victory! Hey guys, I am Dr. Katie Ailes from Aloud Productions, and in today's workshop, I'm going to teach you how to write a list poem. List poetry is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's poetry formatted as a list. That's obviously a really broad definition, and list poetry is a really broad church. The form has been interpreted totally differently by different poets, and there have been loads of clever twists on it over time. Because of all of those variations, this workshop is going to be a little bit different from all the others in our Return to Form series. Unlike writing, say, a villanelle, where there's one structure to use and a ton of rules on how to do it, list poetry is wide open. So the step-by-step approach that you're going to take is totally dependent on what kind of list poem you want to write. So what we're going to do in this workshop is I'm going to go through a ton of examples of different ways to approach list poetry, from the fundamentals to the variations, so that you know what your options are here. I'll point out how each of the poetry examples interprets the list poetry format, and I've linked to all of the examples below in the video description for you to watch after the workshop. And to round off, I'll give you some broad guidance on writing list poetry and lay out the basic steps for how to do it. All that you need to create your own list poem is something to write with and something to write on. So pen and paper, computer, tablet, your phone, whatever you're most comfortable with. This workshop and our entire Return to Form series is supported by the National Lottery through Creative Scotland, and you can check out all of the videos in the project through that playlist linked up there in the eye. All right, guys, let's go for it. Let's start with some definitions. So list poetry, as I said, is simply poetry structured as a list. And that list could have as many entries as the poet wants. It could be numbered or not. There are a ton of options here. In part because it is such a broad poetic form, list poetry is an incredibly popular form. So many poets have written list poems, whether they would necessarily call them list poems or not. And in recent years, particularly in the spoken word and slam scenes, list poetry has become so commonly used that some might say it's a trope. You might even argue it's a cliché. In backlash to the popularity of list poetry, many poets have written parody list poems. Many of them are hilarious. I've linked to 3 in the video description. But before the word cliché puts you off, before you switch the video, I still think that learning how to write list poetry is very, very valuable for 2 main reasons. First, list poetry is a fantastic gateway into writing poetry for new writers and for experienced writers, and particularly for if you're experiencing writer's block and you just need to get words on the page. Whenever I run workshops with new writers, I start by asking them to write lists, like list all of the things that you smell in an average day and be as descriptive as possible. This exercise takes the pressure off the task of writing a poem. You're just writing a list. But when you're done, you'll have written a poem. Secondly, as I said, list poetry is a very broad church. So you might think of a list poem as just a numbered list in a poem, and you might say, meh, I don't really want to do that. But there are so many fantastic twists to explore here. So before you write them off, try writing them on. Give them a go. So let's dive in now to all of the funky ways of approaching list poetry, and let's start off with a tiny bit of vocab so that we're all on the same page. Going back to some poetry fundamentals here, so the basic units of poetry after the individual word are the line and the stanza. A line is, well, a line on the page, and a stanza is a group of lines with space before and after it that we call stanza breaks. The line and the stanza are the most commonly referred to units of poems, but there is a larger grouping which is called a canto. What is a canto? I'll let Mike McGee explain.
The sections between the numbers are cantos. Yeah. 9. This is a canto. 10. So is this. 11.
That clip is from McGee's poem Who's Counting, which is a hilarious send-up of list poems. It's on the Button Poetry YouTube channel and definitely worth watching the whole thing. A canto is basically a section of a poem, and it can consist of as many lines or stanzas as you wish. It could be 2 lines or 882 lines. Your cantos may be numbered, as Mike McGee's are, or you could not use numbers. Up to you. Dividing your poetry into cantos is particularly helpful in long poems, like really long book-length poems. You can think of cantos in poetry like you would think of chapters in fiction, breaking up the action into manageable chunks. Coming back to list poetry now, so you can think of each entry in a list poem, each little section of the poem, as a canto. Again, it can be any length with stanza breaks galore. It's just its own distinct little bit. All right, now that we have that vocab, let's properly dive into all of the very different and glorious incarnations of list poetry. First, we have list poetry in which the cantos are numbered and the numbers go in order, 1, 2, 3, etc., and the numbers are not significant to the meaning of each canto. In contemporary spoken word poetry, usually the poet performs the number of each canto aloud. 1, blah, blah, blah. 2, blah, 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 etc. An example of this approach is Sabrina Benaim's poem Unrequited Love, a play in 9 acts. Each act here is a canto and movingly describes unrequited love. The cantos of this poem vary in length, they shift perspective, so some are in first-person voice, some in third-person voice, and they are numbered in order from 1 to 9. And importantly here, when I say that the numbers aren't significant to the meaning of each canto, I don't mean that the order of the cantos doesn't matter. There's a definite sense of organization, of narrative and emotional arc to Sabrina's poem. All that I mean here is that the specific numbers for each canto don't affect the meaning of that canto. So for example, the 4th canto, the number 4 isn't significant. It just happens to be the 4th canto in the poem. Another quite popular technique to use in list poetry is to have a numbered list where the title of the poem tells you what the list is of. The classic example here is the poem 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird by the American poet Wallace Stevens, first published in 1917. Each canto of this poem describes, well, a different way of looking at a blackbird, a different perspective on the same thing. Wallace Stevens himself described this poem as, quote, a collection of sensations, which I think is a really helpful way of perceiving some list poetry. This list poem and many others are not meant to be a single narrative. Instead, they're sort of a basket, a collection of sensations, of impressions, of perspectives. It's then up to the reader or the audience to make meaning of all of these different things as they're gathered through the poem. Another fantastic and deeply moving example of this technique is Doc Lubin's poem 14 Lines from Love Letters or Suicide Notes. This piece effectively acts as 2 list poems merged into one. Each canto can be read both as a love letter or as a suicide note. It is definitely worth checking out this piece, and like all of the other examples I'm giving here, guys, it is linked in the description below. Moving along here, so the next broad category of list poetry is a list poem without the numbers. Again here, often the title of the poem explains what the list is of. That is what is going on in the stirring piece that Malaika Kagode wrote for this season of Return to Form, entitled Places I Have Felt Safe. Each canto of Malaika's poem is a different place the speaker of the poem has felt safe. Some are literal, physical places, and some are times or feelings. As you can see, the cantos vary in length. Some are entire stanzas, whereas others are just a couple of words. What I love about Malaika's poem is how the tone varies throughout. Even though it's not a narrative poem, there's not a single story being told, there is still a sense of emotional journey. Some of the cantos are soothing, some triumphant, and some dark and upsetting, and Malika leads us through that journey. I'll speak more on this later, but this is a key thing to keep in mind when writing list poetry. Just because it's a list does not mean that there can't be a journey through it, with middle, beginning, and end, and emotional variety. A decision that the poet has to make when performing non-numbered list poetry aloud is how do you distinguish between each canto when there aren't numbers? How will your audience be able to tell when one entry in the list is over and the next one has begun? In Malika's performance, she pauses briefly between each canto, which serves both to differentiate the cantos and to let the material land. This is probably the most popular way of doing it. It's not the only approach, though, and you can get really innovative with how you distinguish your cantos. One such innovator is the brilliant poet Toby Campion in his piece Notes from the Sexual Health Clinic Waiting Room. Here's how Toby sets up the poem.
For the purposes of this poem, if we could all pretend that this is one giant, inappropriately lit sexual health clinic waiting room, just imagine that you're in there, feel the terror coursing through your body. It's a series of short poems, and in between each one, I'm going to give this hand signal. And when I do that, if you could all collectively give one really awkward, uncomfortable cough.
So in this hilarious piece, the audience actually marks the transition between each canto with a chorus of uncomfortable coughs, such as you might hear in a sexual health clinic waiting room. This approach works on so many levels. Toby is just amazing for coming up with this. First, some of the cantos in this poem are actually pretty long, like multiple stanzas long, which means that Toby needs to pause in the middle of the cantos, so just pausing between the cantos wouldn't really work. The audience wouldn't be able to tell where they end, so coughing is a definite transition between the cantos. And of course, this transition is custom built for the context of the poem. It's an uncomfortable cough, like you might hear in a sexual health clinic waiting room, and the audience effectively become the other people in that waiting room. They participate in the performance of the poem. So there you are. That is one of the innovative ways that you can indicate transitions between your cantos if you've chosen not to use numbers in your list poem. Another great example of a non-numbered list poem, which features some great techniques I want to point out, is one of my favorite poems of all time, Jean Verley's 40 Love Letters. Again here, the title explains the concept. The poem is roughly 40 letters, all about love or the lack of it. Here's the beginning of the poem.
Dear Dennis, I still think of you. Dear Andre, I saw you kiss her. Haven't looked back. Dear Patrick, you're just too young. Dear Eric, I said horrible things about you. Your teeth are fine. It's the rest of you I don't like. Dear Greg.
So first, as we can tell, Verley solves the problem of how to transition between cantos without numbers by starting every canto in the same way. Each one begins dear and the addressee's name. This not only works well in the context of the poem, because it genuinely feels like 40 letters to these different people, but it also allows Verley to just run between the cantos without pausing at some points when it serves the pace of the poem without confusing the audience. Secondly, this poem uses repetition brilliantly. The canto, Dear Dennis, I Still Think of You, is repeated 4 times over the course of this poem. It provides both the first and the last canto of the poem, and in that last canto, it's expanded upon. Because a list poem with a ton of entries, like 40 in a roughly 3-minute poem, can run the risk of feeling a bit overwhelming and rapid fire, having this repetition sort of anchors the poem. It also allows a sort of narrative to develop through the piece. Who is Dennis? Why, in the context of all of these other loves, is Dennis so important to keep repeating? So as you're composing list poetry, this is a valuable technique to keep in mind. Consider how can you use repetition to add intrigue, narrative, or emotional punch to your poem. All right, guys, now that we know the fundamentals, the sort of broad categories of list poetry, let's explore all of the ways in which poets have gotten twisty with their lists. I have 4 more examples for you now, guys, of list poems which play with numbers in interesting ways. First up, you can use a numbered list poem which deviates from the linear sequence, which sounds much more complicated than it actually is. An example here is Doug Gary's wonderful piece, straightforwardly titled List Poem. Just reading off the numbers of the cantos, they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 6, 9, 5, 10, 5, 6. So it starts as a traditional list poem with a numbered sequence, and then it swerves off with some cantos repeating, sometimes with variations, sometimes not, and all jumbled in together with the linear sequence. These deviations aren't random, though. The form isn't broken just to break it. Cantos 5 and 6, the ones that are repeated, are about frequently repeated thoughts. Quote, I think about love more often than I write about it, and, quote, I still love you. So form reinforces function here. These cycling thoughts cycle through the poem, interrupting the orderly sequence in the same way that, well, nagging thoughts interrupt our minds. Another great example of this technique is Rudy Francisco's poem Scars / To the New Boyfriend. This devastating piece about a hurtful breakup begins as a linear sequence, but then the poet gets stuck on the number 10, repeating it again and again with different text for each canto, the performance becoming really agitated. This repetition breaks the form of the poem, as if in recognition that this breakup is so painful that it becomes inexplicable, unlistable. It cannot fit in an orderly structure. And this demonstrates, again, how the numbered sequence of a list poem can be broken strategically to represent thoughts that cycle, like in Doug's poem, or here, events that are so traumatic, so disruptive, that they cannot fit within the orderly structure of a list. Okay, another variation on the numbered list poem now. So in some versions, the numbers of each canto can actually be part of the canto's meaning. There are multiple approaches to this, so let's begin with the way that the fantastic Mark Galli approached it in his poem Last Accident, written for this season of Return to Form. Mark's poem is structured as the log of a health and safety representative on a new job, one involving dangerous assets which may or may not be dinosaurs? The first canto begins 8 days since last accident, and as the workplace continues to be a safe place, that count goes up in every canto until, well, I won't spoil the ending for you. So in this list poem, the numbers are significant to the meaning of the poem because they represent elapsed time. Here, the number of days since the last accident. This approach works brilliantly here, not only because the form reinforces the meaning of the poem, but also because as the numbers get higher, the tension builds. How high will they get? How many days can they go without an accident? When is something going to break that beautiful mounting safety record, and what will it be? Dinosaurs! Just one more example here, guys, of a list poem that uses numbers in a meaningful way. Let's look at Kevin McLean's poem Loud Lotto. This piece was created as an in-show advert for our 2018 Edinburgh Fringe show, and it actually features me as a terrifying bingo caller. Here's the clip from the beginning.
I won. The very first time I played, and while yes, I was technically underage, it was still me that put pen to page and wrote numbers down. I won £10, promptly spent it on toys, Cyclops from the X-Men classic blue and yellow, but of course, This was back in the past when you had a 1 in 14 million chance of hitting that sweet jackpot.
A couple of things to notice here, apart from the frankly impressive amount of gel in my hair. First, the numbers in this poem are embedded within the cantos rather than beginning the cantos. So take the first line, I won. You could argue that the word I is like canto 0, and then after the number 1, the first canto actually begins. It just depends on how you want to divide it up. My point here is that in this approach to list poetry, the numbers are embedded within the poetic line. Secondly, there's a clever sneaky homophone in there, so you may have noticed that, of course, the word won is used here in the context of to win the lottery rather than the number 1, but it's used as a number in the context of this list poem. And the other numbers in the cantos don't refer to one consistent thing. Sometimes they're money, sometimes years or days, etc. This poem stretches the concept of a list poem to its breaking point. You might perceive it as a poem which just uses a structure of numbers in interesting ways rather than a true list poem. For me, it's potato, potato. The point, as always with poetic form, is to use it however you wish to create interesting poems, and in my opinion, Kev has nailed that. Alright guys, there are a gazillion other awesome examples of list poems. We could be here all day, but in the interest of time, let's get to some guidance on how to write a list poem yourself. For my first piece of guidance, this may seem way too basic, but it's important to consider, why should this poem be written as a list poem? This is, I think, an important question to ask when writing in any poetic form. What specific qualities does that poetic form have that will serve your idea or your concept? How will the form that you've chosen reinforce the function of the poem, and vice versa? As we've seen, there are a bajillion varieties of list poetry, which means that there are a bajillion great answers to that question, justifying why the form makes sense for you. There's no one right answer for why to use list poetry. Maybe, like Wallace Stevens, you want your poem to be a collection of sensations. Or maybe you want your poem to do funky things with numbers, whether in a linear sequence or breaking that sequence strategically. One simple way of testing whether list poetry is the right format for your piece is to remove the list structure from your draft and see if it still works. It might be the case that if you remove the list structure, the numbers and the pauses between the cantos, and add in some transitional material, your poem might actually work better. Of course, it might not, in which case, grand, you've picked the right format, crack on with your list. And again, guys, I think that this is really helpful advice no matter what form you're tackling. It's always helpful to test out a concept on multiple forms, including freeform, and seeing which version of the poem you like the best. So on a similar note, which variation of list poetry will serve your idea best? Maybe you started writing your list poem with numbers. Would it work better without the numbers? Or vice versa, maybe you have no numbers. Is it worth chucking some in? If you have a linear numbered sequence, would it be worth mixing that up at some point? And in that vein, another really important element to consider is repetition. Perhaps you want to use a repeating thought as a refrain throughout the poem, like Jean Ann Verley's Dear Dennis, I Still Think of You. Or perhaps the frantic repetition of a number or an entire canto breaks down the poem, symbolizing the calamitous loss of logic, like in Rudy Francisco's poem Scars/To the New Boyfriend. My next piece of guidance is to consider the journey that your poem takes your reader or audience on. Specifically, is there a way that your poem can have a narrative or emotional arc? As I said earlier, just because your poem is a list doesn't mean that it can't have a beginning, middle, and end. This arc could be emotional, so maybe your poem begins funny, then eventually gets dark, then resolves happy. Of course, your emotions might be all jumbled up, all mixed up throughout the poem, like Gina and Verley does, but it's important to still have a sense of flow through those emotions. In Verley's piece, the emotions are jumbled, but each canto kind of complements the ones around it emotionally, if that makes sense. It can be hard to define what a narrative or emotional arc looks like because it's so dependent on what the storyteller is going for here. My point here is simply that when you're writing a list poem, don't just chuck the tools of order and storyline and arc out the window. Really consider the sequence of each canto, the journey, the path that your audience or reader takes through the poem, and consider whether it flows. And speaking of flow, my final piece of guidance here is to consider how you're going to perform your list poem while you're writing it, and then to practice that performance when you're done. As with all poetry, how you perform it, how it sounds aloud, is really important. And with list poetry, there's some special elements that you gotta consider. Most fundamentally, how are you gonna distinguish between your cantos? If you're not using numbers, are you gonna begin each line in the same way, like Mark Galli does with 8 days since last accident? In your performance, are you going to pause between each canto? Might it be interesting to try a different approach here, like Toby Campion does in asking the audience to uncomfortably cough? There are so many great approaches to try out here, guys. Just have a play around and be flexible with your poem. All right, that is all of my broad guidance for writing list poetry. So for the final bit of this workshop, the final canto, you might say. No, that's terrible. For the final bit of this workshop, I will quickly talk you through how to write one yourself. So the first step here is to choose the concept for your list poem. If you're new to list poetry, I'd highly suggest picking a category, like memories that make me smile or what I wish I'd never said. That can then form the title of your draft of your list poem, and it makes it simple to organize the cantos, each one being one of those things. Beyond that, as we've seen, the sky is the limit, so really be creative, be imaginative here, let your mind go free. The next broad step in writing a list poem is to draft your cantos. And at this point, do not worry about order or flow or any of that. Just draft different things in your list and get stuff down on the page. As I always advise with drafting poetry, give yourself a ton of time here to really brainstorm and draft a lot of material. You don't have to use all of it, but it helps to have a lot of ideas down. Then, once you've done all of that drafting, then is the point to start considering the flow, the pacing, the narrative and emotional arc of the piece, and determine the order in which your cantos should appear. If you're drafting your list poem on paper, it might help you to actually cut out each canto and rearrange them on a table or on the floor so that you can actually see all of the options for the order of your poem. This is also a great time to consider whether strategically repeating any of your cantos might work well in your piece. And finally, guys, the last broad step in writing a list poem is to read your piece aloud and edit it. Again here, consider how you're performing the transitions or getting the audience to perform them for you, and think about how you can pace the poem, where your pauses are going. Really rehearse this so that you get a sense of flow. And yeah, those are the 4 basic steps to writing a list poem. I've obviously kept that really broad so that it works for pretty much any kind of list poetry that you want to write. You might have certain techniques that you want to use for each of those steps. So for instance, you might want to free write and then pan for gold to come up with your cantos. I would highly recommend that. Of course, use whatever creative writing strategies you feel most comfortable with. Just remember to have fun and to be creative with how you're playing with the list poetry format. And on that note, guys, that is it for our workshop on list poetry. I know that was a little bit different from our usual workshop format. Thanks for bearing with me. I really hope that it gave you a ton of creative ideas for how to tackle this form, and that you now go away inspired to write your own fabulous list poem. And of course, when you do write that fabulous list poem, I would love to read it. You can pop your poem in the comments or share it with us on social media. All of our handles are in the video description. As always, guys, if you have any questions about list poetry and the many varieties of list poetry, I am more than happy to help. Just chuck your question down in the comments. And somehow, miraculously, we are nearly at the end of this season of Return to Form. Our penultimate form, coming up next week, is the renga. This is a collaborative poetic form from Japan, so grab a couple of pals for this one. The thrilling trio of Kate Tuch, Beck Sherwood, and Imogen Sterling have written some beautiful renga for us that we'll be sharing shortly. Guys, if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do, and ring that bell icon while you're there so that you get notified of all of our new videos. And geez a wee like, please. You can directly support what we do here at I Am Loud and get so many amazing perks by signing up to our Patreon for as little as £1 per month. Thank you so much for watching, guys. It means a lot, and happy writing.